Hi everyone, welcome to today's discussion, which is in continuation with our chapter Breathing and Exchange of Gases. In the last class, we have studied about the breathing mechanism, in which we have discussed inspiration and expiration. Now after that, the process that takes place is the exchange of gases. So this we would be discussing, followed by transport of oxygen and carbon dioxide. So first part, that is exchange of gases. Now gas exchange is taking up molecular oxygen from the atmosphere and discharge of molecular carbon dioxide from our tissues and blood to the environment. Now a gas always undergoes net diffusion from a region of high partial pressure to a region of low partial pressure. And this diffusion of gases taking place in our body system is simple diffusion. Now the question is, what is partial pressure? So this partial pressure is the pressure exerted by a gas in a mixture of gases. Now as we know, the atmospheric air that we inhale in, that is actually a mixture of gases in which oxygen, carbon dioxide, nitrogen, some of the rare gases, water vapor, all of them are present. So each part is exerting its individual pressure. Now the total pressure is 760 mm of mercury, and what does it mean? That is, at sea level the atmosphere exerts a downward force equal to that of a column of mercury which is 760 millimeter high. Now in this atmospheric pressure, as we know that oxygen is 21% by volume. So what would be the partial pressure of oxygen? So in this case it is a very simple calculation. This partial pressure will be calculated by this simple calculation, that is 760 mm of mercury, that is the total pressure at sea level, and in this 21% is oxygen. So 21% of this pressure, that means, is exerted by oxygen, and this would be on calculation around 159 mm of mercury. Similarly, we can calculate the partial pressure of carbon dioxide. Now carbon dioxide in the atmospheric air is about 0.03%. So this on calculation will give us 0.3 mm of mercury. Same way we can calculate for nitrogen as well, Pn2, and nitrogen is 78%, so that would be 760 multiplied by 78 upon 100. However, that value is not required because nitrogen, even though we inhale, our body tissues do not utilize it, so as such it will be exhaled out. Now let us see in various parts of the circulatory system what are the partial pressures. Now here, this is a very simplified form of the circulatory system given to us, and here we can see the heart. The right side of the heart is receiving deoxygenated blood coming to it through the vena cava, and from this right atrium the blood goes into the right ventricle, and from right ventricle through pulmonary artery it is going into the lungs. So in the lungs we are trying to show here the alveolus. So here the alveoli where the actual exchange will take place, and here this pulmonary artery is dividing into a capillary network where the exchange will take place, that is oxygen will move from alveoli to the blood and carbon dioxide from blood to the alveoli so that it can be expelled out. And the blood returning to the heart, that is via pulmonary vein. And this pulmonary vein is bringing oxygenated blood to the left atrium. From left atrium the blood will pass into left ventricle, and through aorta it is going to be distributed to all the body parts except the lungs. And in the tissue, so this portion here we can label it as the tissue. And these capillaries, they are the systemic capillaries through which the exchange will take place, that is oxygen will diffuse from blood to the tissue and carbon dioxide from tissue into the blood. Now let us see what all partial pressures are present in various parts of this circulatory system. So the air that we are inhaling in, this air we have just now calculated, PO2 is 159 and PCO2 is 0.3. Now as soon as this air comes into the alveolus are also not empty, it will be mixing up with the air and oxygen will readily diffuse into the capillaries. Because the deoxygenated blood which is coming to the lungs, it is having PO2 as 40 and PCO2 as 45. So we can see the partial pressure differences. Here the air that we have inhaled in, oxygen is at a very high partial pressure, while the blood reaching to the lungs is having oxygen at low partial pressure. So oxygen will diffuse from the alveoli into the blood, and the reverse would be true for carbon dioxide. So in the alveolus, this PO2 will become 104 and PCO2 will rise to 40. Now the blood which is returning from the lungs to the heart and the one which is distributed to the systemic part, that will be having PO2 as 95 and PCO2 as 40. Now if we see these tissues, now tissues are utilizing oxygen, so here PO2 is going to be 40, and if the tissue is highly metabolically active, this value can be even lesser than 40, and PCO2 is going to be 45 or even above, depending on the metabolic activity of this tissue. So again we can see that the blood which is reaching to the tissues, oxygen's partial pressure is 95, while in the tissue it is 40. So oxygen will diffuse from the systemic capillaries into the tissue, while carbon dioxide has a higher partial pressure in the tissue. So from the tissue it is going to diffuse into the systemic capillaries, and after this diffusion, the blood, the deoxygenated blood returning to the heart will have PO2 as 40 and PCO2 as 45. And these values have to be remembered. And one more thing that we can take over here is that the air which is exhaled out, exhaled air, this one has a PO2 of 116 and PCO2 32. So we can see that even the air that we are exhaling out, it is not purely carbon dioxide, it is still having more oxygen in comparison to carbon dioxide. That means our respiratory system does not take all the oxygen that we have inhaled in. Rather, our tissues normally when they are at rest, they will be taking up just 25% of the oxygen which is actually transported by our blood, and 75% of the oxygen is returned to the venous blood. Now what are the various factors which will affect this exchange? So the rate of diffusion will depend on the solubility of gases. If we are comparing two gases, so the one which is more soluble will diffuse faster. For example, CO2 is 20 times more soluble than oxygen, thus it diffuses 20 times faster. The other is the thickness of the membrane. If you remember in the anatomy, we had discussed that the respiratory membrane or the diffusion membrane, that is the alveolar epithelium, capillary endothelium and the basement substance in between, that is 0.2 to 0.5 micrometers. So that is very thin, and if the thickness increases, the rate of diffusion is going to decrease. So that means there is an inverse relationship between thickness and the rate of diffusion. Another aspect is the partial pressure, the differences in the partial pressures. As we have just now mentioned that gases move from a region of high partial pressure to region of low partial pressure. So more will be the difference, more rapid is going to be the diffusion. And last but not the least, temperature. Now increase in temperature increases the rate of diffusion because the molecules will have more kinetic energy when the temperature increases. So their rate of diffusion is also going to increase. Now before going any further, let us recapitulate the various partial pressures that we have discussed. So these columns are left for us to fill, and here we are going to take the partial pressures for oxygen and partial pressure for carbon dioxide. And these partial pressures you need to remember. So whatever we have studied, you can fill these boxes to see whether you remember the values. And all these values are of course going to be in millimeter of mercury. So for inhaled air, PO2 is 159 and PCO2 is 0.3. In the alveolar air, this had reduced because oxygen readily diffuses into the blood while CO2 diffuses from blood into the alveoli, so this increases. Then coming to arterial blood is oxygenated, so here PO2 is more, PCO2 is lesser. In venous blood, it is the opposite. For CO2, it is 45 mm of mercury, while for venous blood, the PO2 is 40. And in the exhaled air, PO2 is 116 and PCO2 is 32. So this is something important which is to be remembered. Now next we will move on to the transport.